November rain lashed the 40th floor windows of the Aldwych Hotel, where chandelier light spilled down over a crowd in evening dress at a charity gala, champagne glittering in slender glasses, laughter rising and falling like a tide that never once reached the people scrubbing the floors beneath it. And just behind all that brightness, in the cold concrete-smelling service corridor of the 40th floor, 28-year-old Cora Lindfist pressed her back against the wall and tried to steady her own breathing. She was a single mother of Scandinavian blood, ash blonde hair pulled back in a hurry, gray eyes long since trained to look down, and for 3 years she'd lived by the single rule that life teaches women like her: be quick, be quiet, and never let anyone see your face. Tonight she'd broken that rule, and she knew she'd pay for it. It had started when she was sent up to the VIP floor storeroom and found a door left unlocked, swinging open at the lightest push, a laptop still glowing beside a stack of printed files, and on it a list of the immigrant women who'd worked in this hotel, with numbers, with dates, and one cold word repeated again and again: liquidated. Beside a name she recognized, Dahlia, the coworker who'd quietly vanished 3 months earlier. A single line had been highlighted in yellow. Her hands moved before her mind had finished deciding. She snapped a photo, tore one sheet free, and pushed it into her shirt, and she'd just turned to leave when a mild voice reached her from the doorway. Mild in the particular way a man's voice goes mild when he already knows he's won. What followed happened too fast: a hand closing around her wrist, a pullback, a struggle at the head of the emergency stair, then the world tipped sideways and she fell, cold steel catching her ankle, her phone skittering into a dark gap, while the man simply walked away, certain that an undocumented cleaner with a broken ankle could never be a threat. But Cora understood that if she stayed down in that stairwell, he could say anything he wanted about her, so she began to drag herself toward the one place in the building where hundreds of witnesses stood close enough together to make a lie difficult. She crawled through the emergency door and into the middle of the gala just as the music stopped, collapsed onto the polished marble, and with everything left in her chest she sobbed, "It hurts, I can't walk." For one terrible moment that glittering room did exactly one thing: it looked away. Someone said she was drunk. A woman drew her gown aside, and not one of those elegant people would spare her the concern they'd have shown a wounded dog. All of them, except one. The only man in that room who looked at her pain and chose to believe her was the man the whole city feared: Soren Vance, the 34-year-old boss of the South Loop underworld, the one they called cold as quenched steel. And she had no idea he'd been hunting for the very thing hidden in her shirt long before she ever fell at his feet. If this story touched your heart, tap that like button so more people get to hear it. Don't forget to share this video with someone who needs reminding that they deserve to be believed. And subscribe right now so you never miss the next part of the story. Standing quietly in the shadowed recess of the grand hall, the man who now stepped forward didn't need to raise his voice to make the entire room feel his presence, because fear always moved ahead of him, like a cold wind threading through a crowd. Soren Vance parted the elegant guests with effortless authority, his broad shoulders framed in a custom dark suit, his deep brown hair already touched with a few early silver strands at the temples, the faint scar running along one side of his jaw catching the crystal light for one brief moment, and his eyes swept across the banquet hall with the calm of a man used to reading an entire room in only a few seconds. He saw the crowd in evening clothes drifting back into a circle of avoidance. He saw 2 hotel security guards moving toward the woman lying on the floor, with the hurried look of men who wanted to clear away a nuisance before it could truly be seen. He saw the night shift manager pressed beside a stone column with one trembling hand lifted to her lips. And at last, his gaze stopped on the marble floor, where a cleaning woman with ash blonde hair spilling loose was curled around her own broken leg. For an instant, the face that was usually as cold as tempered steel didn't change at all, but something behind those eyes sank and hardened at the same time, like the moment before a sheet of ice cracks beneath too much weight. The 2 security guards had bent down, their hands just touching Cora's arm, when his voice rang out, not loud, but clear enough to reach every far corner of the room that only moments earlier had been filled with laughter. "No one touches her." Those 3 words fell into the hall like a stone dropped onto still water, and the 2 guards froze as if the floor itself had ordered them to stop, their hands pulling back, their eyes dropping. The whispering died at once. A champagne glass was lowered too quickly, letting out one small crystalline clink before it, too, fell silent. Soren walked through the crowd as it parted before him, each step slow and steady, slow enough for everyone in the room to understand that he had heard everything, had seen everything, had known exactly what they had just turned away from. Then he did the one thing no one in the entire South Loop could ever have imagined they would see in their lifetime. He lowered himself onto one knee on the cold stone floor beside that woman, his expensive suit touching a surfaceman like him, never knelt upon, and all the diamonds and silk surrounding them suddenly seemed completely still. His hand lifted, hovering over her shoulder, close enough that she could feel the warmth rising from his palm, but he didn't set it down. He didn't touch her without permission. "May I help you?" he asked, and his voice was different now, lowered, stripped of the icy edge that had just frozen the entire room, leaving only a strange steadiness meant for her alone. Cora looked up through her tangled hair, her gray eyes blurred with tears, finding the face bent close to hers, and for one moment she couldn't understand why a stranger would ask permission before helping. Because in the past 3 years, no one in this building had ever asked her anything. They had only given orders, only dragged her away, only pushed her from one place to another the way someone shoved a mop cart. "Don't let him take me back," she whispered, her voice breaking into small shattered pieces, and she didn't say who he was, didn't say where back meant, but there was something in the way she said it, in the naked fear she couldn't hide in time, that made Soren's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. He didn't press her with questions, didn't force her to explain, didn't demand that she prove anything before he would believe her, and that silent trust did what the pain in her ankle could not. It broke something loose inside her chest, a strangled sob she had been trying to swallow ever since she fell. "I won't," he said, and those 2 words were so simple they were almost ruthless in their certainty. Around them, 200 people who only moments earlier had been ready to leave her lying there, until she somehow disappeared, now stood rooted in place, watching the most powerful man in the room kneel on the floor for a cleaning woman they hadn't even cared to look down at only 5 minutes before. And in the eyes of a few of them, for the first time, there flickered something that looked almost like shame, still kneeling on the cold stone floor. Soren let his gaze slide from Cora's tear-soaked face down to the arm she had wrapped around her ribs, and it was there that he saw the thing that made his earlier composure sink another degree. A purple bruise darkening around her slender wrist, the shape of fingers pressed too hard, left behind on her pale, blue-white skin. A mark that couldn't possibly have come from a fall, a mark that could only have come from another hand. He said nothing about it. He didn't let his face reveal what he had just understood, because in a room filled with watching eyes, he knew very well that exposed anger was a luxury a man like him was never allowed to have. But his jaw tightened again, and this time it didn't loosen. Then his eyes caught a small glint of light on the stone floor beside her limp hand, a silver cufflink that had come loose from someone's sleeve during the struggle, having rolled there to remain glittering strangely out of place against the marble. Soren picked it up with 2 fingers, and in the moment he recognized the familiar engraved pattern on its face, something he had seen dozens of times at the wrist of a man who bowed his head to him every morning in the hotel lobby. Something inside his chest cooled and hardened like metal. He didn't say that man's name. He didn't need to. He only closed his hand around the cufflink, slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket, with the slow gesture of a man who had just found the final piece of something he had been dimly searching for all along, then turned back to the woman on the floor, as if, in this entire room, she was the only thing worthy of his concern. "I'm going to lift you now," he said softly, still keeping that strange habit of warning her before every action. "Do I have your permission?" And when Cora gave a small nod, trembling and exhausted, he slid one arm beneath her back and the other beneath the bend of her knees, lifting her off the stone with such care that it was almost tenderness, making sure her broken leg didn't suffer even one more jolt. Rich men didn't carry cleaning women out of their banquet halls, and men like Soren Vance did so even less. Yet all 200 people in the hall could only stand and watch as he straightened with her weight resting against his chest, her ash-blonde hair spilling over the front of his dark suit, and began walking toward the door with a calm that made no one dare block his path. He stopped only once. At the edge of the crowd, A small man in a neat suit was stepping forward with his face arranged into a careful expression of worried concern, both hands clasped behind his back, as if he had merely happened to be present to witness this unfortunate incident, and Cora felt her whole body go rigid in Soren's arms when she recognized Desmond Cade. What Desmond didn't know, what allowed his face to keep that false composure now, was that he believed he had only caught a cleaning girl who had accidentally seen the laptop screen in the accounting office. A witness with no papers, no proof, no voice. A small nuisance he thought he had dealt with neatly at the top of the stairs. And that was why he had walked away at his leisure, without bothering to search her, never knowing that inside the clothes of the woman, now lying in the arms of his employer, there was a sheet of paper snatched in haste, and inside the phone that had flown into the dark crack there had once been a photograph. Soren stopped directly in front of him, and for one moment the two men looked at each other, one with concern carefully staged, the other with a face that revealed nothing but his familiar coldness. "Stay inside this hotel until I'm finished speaking with you," Soren said, his voice not rising in the slightest, because it didn't need to, and Desmond opened his mouth as if to answer with something about an unfortunate misunderstanding, about a clumsy drunken girl, but Soren was no longer looking at him. He had already turned away and continued toward the door, leaving the manager standing there with the smile slowly hardening on his lips, and the first faint feeling that perhaps things had not been handled as neatly as he had believed. Cora woke in a gentle light she didn't recognize at first, the glow from a low-burning fireplace trembling across a high ceiling, and in the hazy space between sleep and pain, she didn't know where she was. She only felt that beneath her back was a mattress softer than anything she had ever lain on, the sheets smelling of clean linen, and some faint scent like wood and rain. Then her ankle throbbed once, and memory came rushing back all at once. The laptop with its bright screen, the hand tightening around her wrist, the fall, the ice-cold marble floor, and the man who had knelt beside her when the whole room turned away. She sat up too quickly and paid for it at once, pain tearing from her ankle all the way to her knee, making her draw in one sharp breath. "You shouldn't move so quickly," a voice said from the doorway, calm and warm, and a woman stepped in with an open leather bag on her arm, her black curls pinned neatly back, her eyes bright behind her glasses, her sleeves still rolled up as if she had just been working. "I'm Dr. Amani Osi," the woman said, setting the bag down at the edge of the bed. "I've set and bandaged your ankle. It's a hairline fracture, not a complete break, but you'll have to keep your weight off it for the next several weeks." Cora looked down at her neatly wrapped leg, then around the spacious room with heavy curtains drawn shut and a marble fireplace, and the reflex trained into her through 3 years of service rose before she could even think. "I shouldn't be here," she said softly, almost speaking to the room itself more than to anyone in particular, her voice carrying the familiar fear of someone who had learned that beautiful places were never meant for people like her, and that appearing in them always came with a price. "You're exactly where you need to be," a deep male voice said, and Soren stepped in from the threshold, his tie loosened at some point and not reedied, his dark hair slightly disheveled, his face marked by the look of a man who hadn't closed his eyes all night. He pulled a chair closer to the bed, but not too close, sat down with both hands resting lightly on his knees, and looked at her as if trying to see whether she was hiding any pain. "This is a guest room in my private wing," he said before she could apologize again. "You're here because you were hurt under a roof I'm responsible for, and I won't allow myself to send you somewhere else to be questioned by people who had already decided not to believe you. You can be certain of a few things," he went on, his voice even and clear, like a man carefully setting the boundaries of safety around her. "Only Dr. Osi and Marisol Vega are allowed to enter this room without your consent. No one is allowed to question you about last night. Your wages will still be paid in full, whether or not you're strong enough to return to work for a while. And Desmond Cade is being kept inside the hotel until I make everything clear." Cora listened to each sentence, and in 3 years of serving powerful families, she had learned to expect all kinds of things from them: indifference, impatience, the careless cruelty that people with power so rarely recognized in themselves. But she had never learned to expect this: a man arranging the borders of her safety, with the precision of someone planning the defense of a fortress, then sitting there, waiting to see whether she thought it was enough. And just as she was about to speak her thanks, Another thought reached her first, more violent than every fear she had for herself, making her seize the edge of the blanket and sit upright despite the pain. "My daughter," she cried, her voice breaking with panic. "Ellie, she's only 4 years old. She's at home with the babysitter, and she has asthma. I have to go back to her. She won't understand why her mother didn't come home, and if I don't show up, they'll—" She couldn't finish the sentence, her breath coming too fast, her gray eyes marked with the terror of a mother who had suddenly realized she was lying an entire city and a long night away from her only child, and Soren only looked at her for one brief moment, then gave the faintest nod, as if he had just understood the most important thing that needed to happen next. Soren didn't soothe her with hollow words, didn't tell her to calm down, or say that everything would be all right, in the way people often spoke to others so they themselves wouldn't have to do anything. He only took out his phone and stepped a few paces into the hallway, and through the narrow opening of the door, Cora heard his voice, low and concise, giving an address, mentioning a woman and a 4-year-old child with asthma, ordering that medicine and a nebulizer be ready for the little girl, ordering them to be gentle and to make the babysitter feel safe by telling her they were his people, not to frighten them. When he came back in, he didn't tell her what he had done as if he had just performed some noble act, didn't wait for her thanks. He only sat back down in the chair beside the bed and said, "My people are on their way to your daughter right now. They'll bring Ellie and your babysitter to a safe, warm place where someone will be standing by in case the child has an attack, and no one will know where they are except you and me." Cora opened her mouth, then closed it again, because over the past 3 years, every time she had mentioned Ellie to anyone in that building, her daughter had always been seen as a burden, a reason she might ask for time off, a weakness someone could seize to bargain over her hours and her pay. Not once had anyone treated her child as a small human being who needed to be kept warm and safe before anything else. She felt something inside her chest loosen, not because the pain had eased, but because for the first time in a very long while, she didn't have to stand alone in the dark and worry about her child by herself. Soren let that moment settle, then asked her a question she would remember for the rest of her life, not because it was beautiful, but because it was simple almost to the point of cruelty in its kindness. "What would make you feel safe enough to tell me what really happened?" he said, and he didn't say she had to tell him, didn't say she owed him an explanation after everything he had done, didn't name any price at all. He only asked what she needed in order to speak, and then he sat quietly and waited, both hands resting lightly on his knees, ready to accept whatever answer she gave him, even if that answer was not right now. Cora stared at him, and she realized that throughout 3 years of service in that building, there had never been a single time, not even once, when someone had stopped in front of her and asked what she needed before deciding what she would be given. People had always decided for her, ordered her, placed her here or there, told her how silent she had to be, and how much she had to endure, so that someone else's comfort wouldn't be disturbed. And the simple act of being asked, of being given the right to choose her own answer, turned out to break something inside her that all of Desmond Cade's threats had never managed to touch. Her mother still sometimes asked her that in the rare letters she sent home, but no one inside that building had ever done so. She felt tears rise, sudden and uninvited, and she lifted the back of her uninjured hand to press against the corner of her eye for a moment, before she could trust her voice enough to speak, not because the question hurt her, but because it showed her so clearly the emptiness she had grown used to living inside, the emptiness where no one had ever thought that she, too, had things that needed to be asked. Soren didn't rush her, didn't fill that silence with his own words. He only gave her time, and that quiet patience told her more than any promise could have, that this man, the one the whole city called as cold as tempered steel, was sitting here in a silent room, with no one for whom he needed to perform, nothing he needed to gain, and still chose to ask her a question no one had ever bothered to ask. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled, but it no longer broke. "I think I'm ready to tell you," she said, "not because I'm no longer afraid, but because, for the first time, I believe the person listening won't turn away." But she still didn't tell him that night, because Soren was the one who stopped her, and that was the last thing she had expected from a man who had just offered to hear the truth. He looked at her face, pale with exhaustion and pain, looked at the way her eyelids were growing heavy, even though she was still forcing herself to sit upright, and he said, "Not tonight. You've endured enough for one night. What you know will still matter tomorrow morning after you've rested, and I'd rather hear it from someone who has slept than force it out of someone who is doing everything she can just not to collapse." Then he did something that left her stunned. He placed a simple prepaid phone on the small table beside the bed, the cheap kind with only a few buttons, and he said, "There's only one number saved in it, mine. If you wake up and feel afraid, no matter what time it is, call me, I'll answer." Cora looked at the phone, then at him, and she almost waited for the next sentence to be that he would have someone stand guard outside her door, or that he would stay in the room to watch over her, because in the world she had lived in, safety always came with surveillance. People kept her from danger by never taking their eyes off her, and kindness always had a chain fastened to it. But Soren only stood, straightened the front of his suit jacket, and said, "I'm not going to sit outside your door as if you're a prisoner of my kindness. You've had more than enough people deciding for you where you're allowed to be and where you're allowed to go. Tonight, this room is yours. This door is yours, and you're the only one who decides when it needs to open." Then he left, closing the door very softly behind him, and for the first time in many years, Cora remained alone in a room not because people had forgotten she existed, but because someone had deliberately given her back the right to be alone. She lay there in the fading firelight, her hand wrapped around that cheap phone as if it were something precious, and she realized that his absence told her more than any presence could have, that trust wasn't being guarded, but being given the right to call or not call, being believed capable of knowing for herself when she needed help. Sleep came and left her many times throughout the night, and at about 3 o'clock in the morning, when the pain in her ankle rose at the same time as a nameless, shapeless fear in the dark, when the unfamiliar room suddenly felt too large and too silent, when every shadow in the corners took on the shape of the hand that had tightened around her wrist, Cora reached for the phone and pressed the only number in it before reason could stop her. He answered on the first ring, his voice awake and clear as if he had never slept, without the slightest trace of irritation, without a single word of reproach for being woken in the middle of the night. Only one simple question, "Are you all right?" Cora opened her mouth, meaning to say that it was nothing, that she was sorry for disturbing him, that reflex of apologizing for her own existence that 3 years of service had carved into her. But then she stopped, and this time she chose to tell the truth. "I'm afraid," she whispered into the darkness. "I don't know why. It's safer here than anywhere I've ever been, and I'm still afraid." He didn't laugh at her, didn't tell her there was nothing to be afraid of. He only said, "Fear doesn't disappear just because your circumstances have changed. Sometimes it stays longer than the danger that created it. You don't need to feel guilty for that." And so they talked, two people at opposite ends of the line in the darkness of 2 different rooms under the same roof, speaking of small, scattered things, of the rain still tapping against the glass, of how Ellie had a habit of sleeping with a worn cloth rabbit in her arms, of how Soren, too, had once known nights when he couldn't sleep at all, and in that strange distance between 2 ends of a phone call, unable to see each other's faces, not having to guard themselves against each other's eyes, they found themselves closer than they had been while sitting in the same room, close enough that when Cora finally drifted off with the phone still pressed to her ear, the last thing she heard was his low, steady voice telling her to sleep, that he wouldn't hang up first. Morning arrived with pale sunlight slipping through the gap in the curtains, and when Soren returned to the room, he brought a tray of hot tea and the news that Ellie and her babysitter had reached a safe place during the night, that the little girl had slept well, and had even asked for pancakes that morning, and that small sentence alone made Cora close her eyes for a moment in relief. Then she sat upright against the pillows, both hands wrapped around the warm teacup as if borrowing a little courage from it, and she began to tell him, this time without hesitation. She told him how Marisol had asked her to bring clean towels up to the storage room on the VIP floor, how the accounting office door had not been locked and had eased open beneath her hand, how the laptop was still glowing beside a printed file, and how she had seen on it a list of women's names, each name followed by numbers, dates, and one repeated word so cold that even speaking it now still made her shiver, liquidated. She told him about Dahlia's name in the middle of that list, the coworker who had cleaned floors beside her for 2 years, The woman who had quietly disappeared 3 months earlier, without a word of farewell. The woman everyone said had simply quit whenever anyone asked. And she told him that beside Dahlia's name there was a line highlighted in yellow, a line whose full meaning she didn't understand, but understood enough to feel chilled through. Soren listened without interrupting, his face growing harder with every sentence she spoke. And when she reached the moment when her hand had acted before her mind could decide, when she had taken a picture of the screen and then snatched one sheet of paper and shoved it inside her clothes, he leaned forward slightly. "I lost the picture," she said softly, her voice sinking with regret. "My phone flew into the stairwell gap when I fell. I don't know whether it's still there or where it may have fallen, but I still have the paper." Then she slid her hand beneath the blanket and pulled out a sheet of paper, crumpled and faintly stained with sweat. The paper she had clutched against her body through the fall, through being carried away, through an entire night of fevered sleep, as if letting it go would mean allowing Dahlia to vanish all over again. Soren took the paper with both hands and read it in silence, and Cora saw the muscle in his jaw twitch once, as his eyes moved down the column of names. Then he said quietly, almost to himself, "This is the only thing left that can still be touched, and that makes it worth more than the photograph we lost." He stood, took out his phone, and called a name Cora had never heard before. "Casper," he said into the phone, "I need you here. Bring everything you've dug up on the money flowing through the hotel's housekeeping division over the past 3 years. And this time, I think we have a lead." When he ended the call, he sat down and explained to Cora what that paper was truly exposing, and for the first time, she understood the full shape of the thing she had stumbled into by accident. "The women on that list," he said, "were all migrant workers like her, women who had come to this country with very few documents and even fewer relatives, and there was a network that had used that very fact against them. They kept the women's identification papers from the first day they were hired, claiming it was procedure, then forced them to work for almost nothing by saying they had to repay an enormous broker's fee debt that had never truly existed, a debt that lived only on paper and grew larger every month so it could never be paid off. And if one of them dared to resist, dared to demand her wages, dared to threaten to report them," he went on, his voice growing lower, "they only had to threaten in return that they would report her as an undocumented immigrant, and the woman would fall silent, because for women like them, being reported meant losing everything. Women like Dahlia, the names marked as liquidated, were the ones who refused to stay silent," he said, "and instead of being kept, they were robbed of every unpaid dollar they were owed and pushed out onto the street with no money, no papers, and just no testimony left to hold on to." He raced so smoothly that no one bothered to ask a second time. Cora sat in silence as she listened to those words, because she realized that Dahlia's name on that paper was not the end of a story, but the echo of a story she herself had nearly been forced to continue. Casper Vance arrived less than an hour after the call, a slender man with thin-framed glasses and the quiet bearing of someone more accustomed to working with numbers than with people. And he spread a thick stack of papers across the desk in Soren's study, papers he had been quietly gathering for many months ever since his employer first suspected there was a strange current of money flowing beneath the foundation of his empire. "The paper Cora kept is the missing piece I didn't have," Casper said, placing it beside his bank statements, "because all this time I could see the money moving out, but I couldn't figure out where it was going or whose hands it passed through. And now I have a name to follow." He showed Soren what months of isolated digging had never been able to reveal, that the withdrawals from the hotel's housekeeping division hadn't disappeared randomly at all. They had been transferred steadily, neatly, systematically, to a labor brokerage company with a name so harmless no one bothered to notice it. A company that, on paper, specialized in supplying cleaning and service staff to a whole line of hotels across the region. A company with a properly registered office, a seal, signatures, and every legal-looking surface of an ordinary business. But when Casper traced back the name behind that company, he said he had run into one front after another, one subsidiary hiding behind another parent company, every layer carefully built to conceal the layer beneath it, and that wasn't the kind of structure a lone man like Desmond Cade could have built by himself. It was the structure of someone with money, with lawyers, with an understanding of how to wash a dirty stream of money until it looked no different from clean money. Soren stood silently by the window, looking down at the gray city beneath the rain that still hadn't stopped. And for the first time he understood that what he was facing wasn't a greedy manager quietly stealing from his hotel, but an entire machine, and Desmond was only the most visible cog in it, the convenient face to take the blame if everything came apart, while the person truly holding the money and the power remained hidden somewhere behind those layers of paperwork. The real name buried at the end was still an empty space on Casper's page, but both men knew it was the most dangerous empty space of all, because a machine this large couldn't have survived. For 3 years under Soren's own roof, unless someone powerful enough had been backing it, and clever enough to keep everything looking clean. While the two men bent over the bank statements, on another floor of the hotel, Marisol Vega was cleaning the next room with the slow, distracted movements of someone whose mind was very far away. She had heard in fragments that the cleaning woman who had fallen in the banquet hall the night before was still inside the owner's private wing, that Desmond Cade had been held back and not allowed to leave the hotel, that a strange man carrying an entire folder of documents had come to see Mr. Vance early that morning, and every scrap of news made her hands tremble a little more. When a young maid passed by and happened to mention Cora's name, Marisol dropped the stack of towels in her hands, and as she bent down to pick them up, she realized she was holding her breath. For the past 3 years, she had followed every one of Desmond's orders without ever daring to ask why, had signed her name on papers she didn't dare read too closely, had turned her eyes away each time one of the girls on her staff quietly disappeared. And she had told herself that she was only a paid employee, that she didn't have the right to choose, that keeping her job mattered more than asking questions. But now, as she stood in the middle of the room with the stack of towels trembling in her hands, the image of that young woman collapsed on the marble floor, while 200 people turned their faces away, kept returning to her mind again and again, and for the first time in many years, the silence with which she had bought her own peace began to feel heavier than the fear of losing her job. And she understood that a time would come when she would be forced to choose between the two. It was not until late afternoon, after Casper had traced the money back through even more years to reconstruct the history of the network, that he struck something that made even him, a man accustomed to keeping his face flat and unreadable before any number, stop short and read it again and again, 3 times, to make sure he had not seen it wrong. In an older file, kept from 3 years earlier, among a list of names whose ink had begun to fade, there was a name he had heard mentioned all day long, Cora Lindqvist, and beside it was not the word liquidated like the other names, but a different note placed under consideration, and right after that, in one decisive, crossed-out stroke, a single word, failed. Casper brought that page to Soren without saying a word, only set it down and pointed to the line, and Soren stared at it for a long time, before his face changed in a way Casper had never seen in his employer before. When Soren carried that page back to the room where Cora was sitting beside the window watching the rain, he placed it in her hands as gently as if it might shatter, and he said softly, "I need you to read this, but I want you to know first that you're safe here, no matter what it says." Cora looked down, and for one moment she couldn't understand why her name was lying inside a file that was 3 years old. Then one memory after another, all of them buried long ago, began to rise to the surface. The time when she had first set foot in this country, so alone she had felt almost transparent, with no family, no connections. Only a few scarce documents and a desperation deep enough to make her accept any work anyone offered her. She remembered the labor brokerage company that had promised her work and housing that year. She remembered the way they had demanded to keep her papers from the very first day. She remembered the cold instinct crawling up her spine that had made her run in the middle of the night before that rope could tighten fully around her, leaving everything behind to disappear into another city, changing the place where she worked, changing even the neighborhood where she lived, and telling herself she had escaped. She had thought she had escaped, but now, looking at her own name crossed out with the word "failed" on that page, then looking at the other sheet she had snatched from the accounting office the night before, she understood a truth that turned her whole body cold, that the brokerage company that had nearly swallowed her 3 years ago and the network operating beneath this hotel roof were not 2 different monsters, but the same one, and that when she had applied for that seemingly harmless night cleaning job, through a labor broker. She had unknowingly stepped straight back into the mouth of the very net she had once risked everything to escape. "I thought I had gotten away," she whispered, both hands trembling. "I ran so far. I left everything behind, and it turns out I only ran in a circle and came back to the very place where it began, and for the past 3 years, I've been sleeping under the roof of the very people who once hunted me without even knowing it." Soren lowered himself onto one knee beside her chair, the second time he had knelt because of her, and this time there were no 200 people watching, only him, her, and the truth laid bare between them. In that silence, something was collapsing inside him too, because when he looked again at the handwriting on that old file, he realized it had been created in his father's time, Magnus Vance, the man who had built the entire empire Soren had inherited, and that meant the woman sitting before him, trembling, had been, 3 years ago, nothing more than a crossed-out line in his father's ledger, a name the man who had given him life had once considered the way one might consider merchandise. He did not say that aloud. He couldn't. But Cora saw it appear in his eyes, and for the first time, she understood that the pain in this room no longer belonged only to her. That night Soren didn't sleep, and this time it wasn't because of the familiar bouts of sleeplessness that had followed him for years, but because inside his mind there was a struggle unfolding, in a way he himself had never had to face so nakedly before. He sat alone in his dark study, before him the old file page with Cora's name crossed out and Casper's stack of statements, and he knew that with the power in his hands, he could make all of this disappear in a single night. That was how he had been taught to solve every problem, the way his father had done all his life, the way an entire underground world operated. People didn't expose a wound to the light. They stitched it shut in the dark and never spoke of it again. He could make Desmond Cade vanish quietly, could cut off the money stream and wipe clean every trace of the brokerage company, could use his money and power to build a wall around Cora so safe that no one would ever touch her again, take her and her daughter somewhere far away, provide for them for the rest of their lives, and no one would ever know anything had happened at all. For many hours, that seemed like the only obvious answer, clean and neat, and most importantly, it would keep her safe, and keeping her safe had now become something he wanted even more than punishing the people who had hurt her. But every time he finished building that perfect plan in his mind, something stopped him, and it wasn't until nearly dawn that he realized what it was. He remembered her face when he had placed the phone on the table and told her she was the only one who could decide when her door needed to open. He remembered the way something inside her had loosened simply because, for the first time, someone had given her back the right to choose, and he understood that his perfect plan, though born from kindness, was really only a more refined version of exactly what everyone else had done to her all her life, deciding for her where she could be, what she could know, and how she could live, without ever once asking what she wanted. He would turn her again into a person being arranged, a person kept safe inside a beautiful cage, another line in another ledger. Only this time that ledger would be written with tenderness instead of cruelty, while she still had no voice in it at all. Soren sat with that thought for a very long time, and it unsettled him in a way very few things in life still could, because for years he had allowed himself to believe he was different from his father, that he was cold but fair, that he wasn't the kind of man who crushed the weak, and yet now he realized that the line between protecting a person and controlling a person was far thinner than he had imagined, and that he had almost stepped across it while still convinced he was doing the right thing. He still didn't know which path he would choose, because the path that allowed her to decide for herself was also the most dangerous one. It meant bringing the truth into the light. It meant touching people with power, people even he had to treat with caution. It meant placing Cora's safety in Cora's own hands, and a part of him, the part forged to control everything, screamed that doing such a thing was madness. But as dawn began to gray the window, Soren understood that whatever he ultimately chose, there was one thing he would not do. He would not decide it for her in the dark, and then come to her in the morning to announce it as if handing down a sentence. And that small thought alone, that newly sprouted seed that this choice had to belong to her, quietly carried him farther away from the man his father had been than all the years before it combined. The name hidden behind all the layers of fronts that Casper had not yet managed to trace revealed itself the very next morning, not on any bank statement, but in flesh and blood, walking into Soren's study with the smile of a man who had never once in his life needed to knock on a door twice. Roland Thorne was a man in his 50s, with smooth silver hair and a perfectly tailored suit, a well-known politician in the region. An investor whose name appeared on sponsorship plaques for all kinds of charitable foundations, including the very foundation for which the fateful party the night before had been held, and he entered with the easy familiarity of someone long accustomed to assuming every door would open before him. "Soren," he said, sitting down in the chair across from him without waiting to be invited, "I heard there was an unfortunate incident under your roof, involving a cleaning employee, and I came here as an old friend of your family to see whether I might help you handle it, before it has to grow into something difficult for both of us to control." Soren did not rise to greet him, did not pour a drink, only leaned back in his chair and looked at the man before him with the flat, still gaze that had made men far harder than Roland step carefully, and he said, "There's nothing here that needs to be handled, only a crime, and I intend to make sure it answers for itself." Roland's smile did not waver, but something behind it sharpened, and he leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice into that intimate register powerful men used when they wanted to wrap a threat in sugar. "I understand your integrity, sis. And I admire it, I truly do," he said. "But you're Magnus's heir, and you know very well that there are certain things that, once spoken aloud, can never be taken back. A name, just one name, if said in the wrong room, before the wrong people, then no power on this earth can call it back again. And the price of such a careless word is never paid only by the person who spoke it." He left the sentence hanging in the air for a moment, long enough for both of them to understand that it was not advice but a warning. Then he leaned back again, putting on his friendly expression as if nothing had happened. "That girl," he continued, his voice full of false concern. "Think about it. An undocumented employee recovering in your private wing, right at a time when important business matters for both you and me are at their most sensitive stage. People will talk, and they'll talk whether or not any of those rumors are true. For her own good as well as yours, perhaps it would be best to move her somewhere farther away, quieter, safer, somewhere she can recover without dragging unnecessary talk behind her." Soren listened to all of it without letting anything show on his face, and inside, he recorded every detail with the coldness of a hunter counting the tracks of his prey. Because the very fact that Roland Thorne had come here in person, the very fact that he knew too much about a cleaning employee, who should not have been worth the attention of a man like him, the very way he mentioned a name that should not be spoken aloud, all of it confirmed what Casper's stack of papers had only suggested, that the most dangerous blank space on the page, the real name hidden behind every layer of fronts, was now sitting directly in front of him and smiling. "Thank you for your concern," Soren said after a silence long enough for Roland to understand that his words had not shaken him. "I'll consider your advice," and Roland rose to leave with the satisfied air of a man who believed he had just set a piece in place, never knowing that in the room he had just left, the man known as cold as tempered steel was sitting very still, weighing the cost of every road ahead, and realizing for the first time that the right path might also be the one that could cost him the most. If Roland Thorne's threat came from outside like a cold wind striking the window, then the pressure that followed was far more dangerous, because it came from within, from the most loyal people around him, people who did not want to harm him at all but, on the contrary, only wanted to protect him, and that was what made it so hard to refuse. An older advisor who had served his family since Magnus's time sat down and said, with a voice full of good intentions, that the wisest course was to let Desmond Cade quietly resign, with no noise, no investigation, a smooth departure that would preserve everyone's dignity, because dragging a manager into the light also meant dragging the entire hotel with him. Another man, worried about finances, reminded him that Roland Thorne's investments were tied tightly to a whole series of projects that many people depended on, and that a scandal breaking open now would bring damage that would spread even to the innocent. And then the person he trusted most also gently suggested a solution that sounded so reasonable, so sensible, that it was almost impossible to argue with. Give the girl enough money to start her life over somewhere else, enough to care for the child, then let her leave in peace, while that stack of files could be placed in a locked drawer where it would never trouble anyone again. That way, she would be safe, he would have peace, and no one would have to suffer. Soren sat and listened to all of it, and what chilled him was not the cruelty of those words, but their kindness, because not one of the people advising him was evil, not one of them wanted to see Cora hurt. Each of them was only offering a small, reasonable, well-meaning suggestion, a compromise so tiny that by itself it did not seem wrong at all. And in that very moment, sitting among kind people who were taking turns advising him to do the easy thing, Soren understood a truth he had never looked at directly in all these years, that people like Desmond Cade, networks like the one operating beneath his roof, had never been protected by one lone villain at all. They were protected by exactly this scene, by 100 decent people offering 100 reasonable compromises, each compromise small enough that everyone could still feel innocent, but together enough to build a wall no victim could ever break through. Dahlia had disappeared quietly in exactly this way, he thought, not because one cruel man had acted, but because a long line of good people had chosen to look away, had chosen what was easy instead of what was right, had told themselves it wasn't their business. And he realized that if he now nodded to even one of those well-meaning pieces of advice, just one, then he would be no different from them. He would only be the final brick in that wall, the 101st decent man, placing his own compromise on top of a woman's silence. He did not answer at once, did not reject anyone, only thanked them for their honesty, and let them leave one by one. But when the door closed behind the last person, he sat alone for a long time in the quiet room, and for the first time in his life, the easy silence upon which his entire world had been built suddenly became impossible to bear. That afternoon, while Cora was sitting beside the window with the small notebook Soren had given her so she could write down everything she remembered about Dahlia and the others, the phone in the room rang, not the prepaid phone with only Soren's number in it, but the room's desk phone, the one no one outside should have known about. She hesitated for a moment, then lifted the receiver, and on the other end there was a silence that lasted just long enough to chill the back of her neck before a voice came through, a man's voice even. Calm, not loud at all, the kind of calm more frightening than any shouting. "Miss Lindqvist." The voice said, "I hope you're recovering well, and I also hope your little Ellie is still healthy. A 4-year-old girl needs her mother beside her more than anything else, doesn't she? A child that age needs a steady home and a mother who comes back every night. Not a mother tangled up in trouble in places where she shouldn't be tangled." Cora felt as if an icy hand had slipped into her chest and squeezed her heart shut, because that name, Ellie's name, spoken from a stranger's mouth through a line she knew nothing about, told her everything the person on the other end wanted her to understand without needing to say another word outright. They knew about her child. They knew the little girl's name, knew her age, knew that in this vast city Cora had one single weakness shaped like a 4-year-old child, and the mere fact that they had let her know they knew was enough to turn every sense of safety Soren had worked so carefully to build around her into something as fragile as thin ice over a lake. She didn't ask who the caller was. She knew she wouldn't get an answer, and the voice didn't wait for her to respond. It only added one final sentence in a tone of false concern colder than any open threat. "Think carefully about what truly matters to you, Miss Lindqvist. Some women are wise enough to know when to stay silent in order to keep the most precious thing in their lives." Then the line went dead, leaving her sitting there with the receiver still pressed to her ear and the steady beeping echoing into a room that suddenly felt too large. She sat motionless for a long time, both hands trembling, and the first reflex that rose in her was the reflex life had trained into her since she could remember. Stay quiet, make yourself small, do whatever must be done to keep your child safe, even if it means burying the truth and letting Dahlia and all the others remain forever as crossed-out names. For one long, dark moment she had almost decided to do exactly that, to tell Soren she had changed her mind, that she didn't want to be involved any further, that she only wanted to hold her child and disappear. But then, when the first wave of panic settled enough for her to think clearly, another truth appeared with a cold and piercing clarity, that if she stayed silent, the person on that phone would not let her go. On the contrary, her silence would be the very thing that handed them power forever, because once she accepted bowing her head out of fear for her child this time, they would know they could always make her bow again, and her small family would remain forever within reach of an even voice that could call at any hour. She realized that the silence people had told her, All her life would keep her safe, had never truly kept her safe at all. It had only delayed the day when she would have to pay the price, and now it was threatening Ellie's future too, threatening to turn her daughter into a child who grew up beneath the shadow of a secret her mother had been too afraid to speak aloud. When Soren entered the room a few minutes later and saw her bloodless face, he stopped sharply at the threshold, and Cora looked up at him, her gray eyes no longer holding only fear, but something else too, something harder beginning to take shape. And she said softly, "They just called me, and I'm not going to be silent anymore." Soren listened as she told him about the call, every word of it, and Cora saw the moment his face changed when she mentioned that the caller had spoken Ellie's name. She saw his hand close into a fist and then open again in a visible effort to hold himself back. And when he spoke, his voice carried the dangerous calm of a rage large enough to level an entire building. "Then this has gone too far," he said, "and I'm not going to let you sit here any longer as a target for them to aim at. I have a house in Wisconsin, discreet, safe, impossible to trace. I'll take you and Ellie there tonight. You'll be protected properly, you won't have to worry about anything, and I'll handle the rest." He said it with all the urgency of a man who only wanted to shield her, and for a moment he did not realize that he had stepped straight into the very crossroads he had spent the previous night weighing in his mind, that he was repeating the exact thing he had promised himself he would not do. Cora sat in silence and listened until he had finished, and when he stopped she did not cry, did not panic. She only looked at him with a strange calmness, then set the small notebook down on her lap and spoke in a voice that trembled but held steady, choosing each word carefully, like someone who had rarely been allowed to choose anything at all in her life. "You're planning to move me away," she said. "You're planning to transfer me from this room to another room, from one place to another, exactly the way people have done to me all my life, so I can be hidden so well that no one has to see what happened to me anymore, so the truth can be put away neatly with me in some distant place where it won't trouble anyone." She paused for a beat, her breath faintly shaking, then went on. "All my life, I've been told where to stand, how silent to be, how much to endure, so that someone else's peace wouldn't be disturbed. And 3 years ago, when that net first closed around me, I ran. I left everything behind and ran into the night because I thought running was the only way to survive. And yet I only ran in a circle and came back to the very place where it began. I won't run anymore, Soren," she said, and her voice rose, not with anger but with a kind of resolve she had never known she possessed. "I won't be hidden away one more time, not because I'm not afraid, but because I've realized that hiding never makes me safe. It only makes me someone who will always have to run, and I won't let my daughter grow up with a mother who is forever looking over her shoulder." The room sank into silence after those words, and Soren stood there looking at her, and Cora saw something slowly change in his face, like the moment a man catches his own reflection in a mirror he never wanted to look into. "You're right," he said at last, his voice so quiet it was almost only breath. "I almost did to you the very thing I despise in everyone who has ever decided for you, without bothering to ask what you wanted. I told myself I was different from them, that I was doing it because I wanted to protect you, but it turns out the line between protecting a person and imprisoning a person inside a beautiful cage is separated by exactly one question I forgot to ask." And he did not try to excuse himself further, did not explain that he had only wanted what was best for her, did not try to soothe his own discomfort with any defense. He only straightened, accepting the full weight of his mistake without turning away from it, and then he did the hardest thing a man used to controlling everything could do. He handed the power back to her. "Then tell me," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "What do you want to do? And this time I won't decide for you. I'll stand behind your choice, whatever it is." Cora did not answer right away. She let his offer settle, let the strange feeling of being asked what she wanted sink into every part of her. Then she lifted her head and said with a clarity that surprised even herself, "I want to bring this into the light myself." And she emphasized the word myself, as if it were the most important thing in the entire sentence. "Not through you," she went on, "not hiding behind your power, so you can say the things that need to be said in my place. Because if I do that, then for the rest of my life this will always be something you did for me, another debt I have to carry. And I'm so tired of having my entire life defined by what other people do for me or do to me. This time, I need it to be something I did myself, even if it's harder, even if it's more dangerous. Soren looked at her for a long time, and instead of arguing, instead of giving her 100 reasons why it would be safer for him to stand in front of her, he only nodded slowly. And in that nod there was both respect and something softer, that he was not yet ready to name. He stepped closer to hand her the notebook she had dropped on the floor. And when he bent down and then straightened again, he realized the distance between them had narrowed more than he had meant it to. Close enough that he could clearly see the lighter flecks of gray in her eyes. Close enough that he could hear the faint rhythm of her breathing in the quiet room. For one moment, they both stood still inside that fragile distance, and Soren felt his gaze drawn down to her mouth, for an instant before he became aware of it, and then he did something that demanded more willpower than anything else he had done that day. He deliberately lifted his eyes back to hers, firmly, and stepped back half a pace. "You don't know," he said softly, his voice lower than usual and carrying a clear effort to restrain himself. "You don't know how difficult you make self-control." Cora did not step back, and a part of her, the part that had been forbidden for too long to want anything for herself, whispered that she didn't want him to leave, that she wanted that fragile distance to close, but she did not say it aloud. She only looked at him, and in that look there was both longing and the fear of a person who had never been taught how to want something without having to pay for it. "Do you want me to go?" Soren asked, and the question was not a refusal, but another handing over of power. He placed the decision in her hands exactly as he had just promised to do with every other decision. "No," Cora answered, so softly it almost had no sound, and it was the truth. She didn't want him to go, but Soren still went, and the very fact that he left even after she had asked him to stay told her more than anything he could have done if he had stayed. He placed the notebook in her hands, letting his fingers linger against hers for one heartbeat longer than necessary. Then he stepped back toward the door and said, "Not because I don't want to stay, but precisely because I do, I'm going to leave. Because right now you feel indebted to me, you're under my roof, you're depending on my protection, and I'll never allow anything to happen between us while the balance between us is still so uneven. I won't let you have to wonder whether you chose this because you truly wanted it, or because you felt you owed me. When you're standing firmly on your own feet, when you're free to choose this without a single thread of gratitude binding you," he said, his hand resting on the doorknob, "I'll still be here, and then I'll ask you again." Then he left, closing the door very softly behind him, leaving her sitting alone with her heart beating wildly and a new truth just beginning to reveal itself. That being desired by someone who still chose to respect her was, it turned out, something she had never known she had the right to expect. It was well past midnight when a very soft knock sounded at Cora's door, hesitant and timid enough that at first she thought she had imagined it, and when she called for whoever it was to come in, the door eased open to reveal Marisol Vega standing there in the dim hallway light, both hands twisting together in the hem of her uniform jacket, her face pale, and her eyes red-rimmed like someone who had either been crying or had gone many nights without sleep, or both. The night shift supervisor stepped into the room with the uncertain footsteps of someone who was not sure she had the right to be there, then stopped in the middle of the room, and it took a long while before she found enough courage to speak, her voice breaking from the very first sentence. "I came to tell you the truth," Marisol said, "the truth I should have told a long time ago. And I'm sorry, I'm more sorry than words can ever say." She told her, little by little, that for the past 3 years she had followed every order Desmond Cade gave, without ever daring to ask why, that she herself had signed the dismissal papers for Dahlia and the other girls. Papers accusing them of things they had never done, and that every time a girl quietly disappeared from her staff list, she had chosen to lower her head and look away, telling herself she was only an employee, that if she didn't do it, someone else would, that keeping her job so she could feed her own family mattered more than asking questions about the fate of women she did not even know well. "I was afraid," Marisol said, tears streaming down her face. "I was afraid of Desmond. I was afraid of losing my job. I was afraid I would become the next name on the list if I dared to open my mouth, and I let that fear buy my silence for 3 whole years." Then she looked up at Cora and added something that left Cora completely still. "The night I asked you to bring clean towels up to the VIP floor storage room, I swear to you, I didn't know. I didn't know the accounting office was unlocked that night. I didn't know there were any files in there. I only saw we were short on towels, and you were the closest person nearby. I didn't lead you there on purpose, and the thought that my careless request nearly got you killed has tormented me every night since." Cora looked at the woman standing before her, trembling, and she realized she did not feel the anger she had expected to feel, because she understood that fear too well. She had lived inside it all her life. She knew how completely it could choke a person, knew how it could make someone convince herself that silence was the only thing she could do, and she reached out her uninjured hand and took Marisol's shaking hand in place of an answer. But Marisol was not finished. She drew in a deep breath as if gathering the last of her courage, then said, "And I didn't come here only to apologize. I came because I can help. I know something maybe no one else knows. Desmond is a man who never trusts anyone. Not even the people who pay him," she said, "and because of that, he always keeps something back to protect himself. A copy of everything, every file, every list, every number. He keeps them in an old storage room behind the basement laundry area, a storage room almost no one uses anymore, in case the people above him ever betray him and he needs something to bargain with." Cora felt her heart beat harder, and within half an hour she and Marisol, with the quiet support of Casper, who had been called in during the night, had slipped through the empty basement corridors to that old storage room, and behind years of untouched dust, behind stacks of tarps and broken machines, they found a locked metal box, and inside it was exactly what Marisol had said, a complete copy of everything, not only the list Cora had seen, but the entire file stretching back many years, the money trails, the names, the signatures, enough to give one woman's testimony a shape that could no longer be denied. Casper lifted the stack of papers beneath the flashlight beam and turned page after page, and when he looked up at Cora, there was a light in his eyes she had never seen before. "Here it is," he said softly. "This is what we need. Now your truth doesn't have to stand alone anymore." The next morning, with Desmond's backup files safely in hand, Soren summoned the manager to his study for the last time. There were no raised voices in that room, no hands lifted, because for a man like Soren Vance, the heaviest punishment had never been the kind delivered through violence. He only placed on the desk before Desmond the silver cufflink he had picked up from the banquet hall floor that night, letting the manager understand that the game was over, then told him in that terrifyingly flat voice that from this moment on he had nothing left, no position, no protection from the organization, no door anywhere in this city that would open for him, and that if he had any wisdom left, the best thing he could do was leave Chicago before sunset and never let anyone see his face here again. Desmond Cade. A man who had grown used to using his small, quiet power to make so many women tremble, left that room like a deflated shadow, losing everything he once had in only a few sentences, and by that afternoon his name had disappeared from the hotel so smoothly that the smoothness itself felt like a bitter irony, because that was exactly how so many girls like Dahlia had once been made to disappear, except that this time the one disappearing was him. That same day, Soren cut off completely the money stream flowing through the hotel's housekeeping division, dissolved the hidden branch that had forced so many people into debts that had never existed, and ordered that every immigration document still being held be returned to every migrant employee, one by one, without a single person missing. When Casper asked him whether he was certain about touching something that had existed since his father's time, something that had quietly profited the family for so many years, Soren stood silently by the window for a long while before answering, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who had just decisively shed part of his old self. "A name that survives only by making women too afraid to speak," he said, "isn't a legacy, it's a debt, and I've been paying it for my father for years, without even knowing it, but I won't pay it for one more day." But Soren also understood clearly the limits of what he could do, because he knew that punishing Desmond and severing that hidden branch had only cut one limb from a poisonous tree, while the true roots, the larger machine, with its layers of front companies and its carefully laundered streams of money, still remained intact, and the man behind it, Roland Thorne, still stood beyond the reach of any underworld rule Soren could use. "A man like Roland can't be dealt with by the methods of my world," he told Cora when she came to see him that afternoon, "because he doesn't live in my world. He lives in the light, in boardrooms and fundraising dinners, protected by reputation and connections, and the only thing that can touch a man like that is the very light he hides inside, the law, a file placed on the right desk, one that can't be bought. And this is the most important part, he said, placing the backup files in her hands. All of this evidence, the money trails, the front companies, the signatures, everything points to Roland Thorne and his brokerage company. Not a single page in this stack touches my organization. I had Casper check every sheet carefully, and that means when you bring it into the light, you'll strike exactly the person who needs to be struck, without a single thread leading back to me for them to use to silence you. He paused, then added in a softer voice, "My work in the dark is finished now. The part that brings it into the light, that part is yours just as you wanted." 3 days later, on a clear morning after many days of rain, Cora Lindfist walked on her own to the front doors of the Federal Bureau of Investigation office in Chicago, leaning on crutches, alone, with a stack of files pressed tightly in her hands, and the statement she had written in her mind through so many nights until she knew every word by heart. Soren had offered to go with her, not to speak for her, only to stand there beside her in case she needed him. But Cora had shaken her head and told him with a gentleness that carried no reproach at all, "If you stand beside me in that room, then for the rest of my life this will always be something you did for me, and I need it to be something I did myself. You understand that?" And Soren had understood. He had only squeezed her hand once, lightly, and let her go, and that letting go was the greatest act of love he could give her. But when Cora stood before those tall glass doors, her steps halting as one last wave of fear rose suddenly inside her. A shadow moved up beside her, and when she turned she saw Dahlia, thinner than before, more tired than before, but still Dahlia in flesh and blood, the woman who had found her own way here without anyone calling her. "You spoke for me when I was still only a crossed-out line in a ledger," Dahlia said softly, her voice trembling but her eyes steady. "Now let me stand beside you. You don't have to do this alone." And the two women, two names people had once intended to liquidate in silence, took each other's hands and walked through those doors together. The federal investigation did not begin like thunder, but like water slowly pulling back after a dam had broken, through one interview after another, one page of records matched against another, one victim after another, finding the courage to speak when they learned they were no longer alone. And each layer of the fronts Roland Thorne had built with such care began to peel away piece by piece. He did not collapse in one night. Men like him rarely collapsed that way. But he lost the trust of allies who had once treated his name like gold, lost the respectable shell behind which he had hidden for so many years, and at last he had to stand before the law and answer for a machine he had believed would never reach him. As for Cora, when everything settled, she did not choose to vanish into the quiet life she could have taken. Instead, she used her own story to build something, a center for immigrant women and single mothers like herself, a place where they could learn a trade, learn the language, understand their rights, and most importantly, a place where no one had to collapse first in order to be believed. When rumors began to spread, poisonous whispers saying she was nothing more than the mistress of a crime boss hiding beneath a charitable disguise, Cora did not let Soren answer for her. She stepped forward herself on the day the center opened, stood before the crowd with a voice that no longer trembled, and said, "No woman should have to fall before people agree to believe her. I have fallen twice in my life, once on the stone floor of a banquet hall, and once 3 years ago when no one was there to see it, and I built this place, so the women who walk through that door will never have to fall even once before they are heard." It was only when she truly stood firmly on her own feet, with her own home, her own work, and a life she had chosen for herself rather than one granted by someone else's pity, that Soren came to her, and this time he did not kneel as he had on that first night on the marble floor. He only stood before her as one equal standing before another, and he asked softly, "May I?" the same request for permission he had kept from the very first moment. And this time Cora did not answer with words. She only reached out and pulled him close, closing for herself the distance both of them had guarded for so long. And that kiss carried the full weight of all those months of restraint, tender and unhurried, a choice she made in freedom, and not a debt she had to repay. And one dawn not long after that, people saw Cora walking along the little path leading to the center without needing crutches anymore. Her ankle healed into a distant memory, and Soren walked beside her, not ahead of her to show the way, not carrying her, as he had on the night the whole room turned away, but simply keeping pace with her, slowing himself to match her steps, going wherever she chose to go, while from the windows of the center behind them came the clear laughter of a 4-year-old girl, playing in the warmth and peace her mother had won back through her own courage. And if there is one thing left behind by this story, it is that Cora had never truly needed anyone to save her. She only needed someone willing to believe her when the whole world turned away, and from that small belief, she learned the most precious thing of all, to become the person who would always believe and stand beside herself. Cora's story reminds us of something simple and profound, that a person's dignity does not lie in their status or wealth, but in being seen and heard as a human being, that sometimes the kindest thing we can do for someone is not to save them, but to believe them and give them the right to walk on their own. And that silence, born from fear, has never truly kept us safe. Only the courage to speak opens the road to freedom. If this story has touched your heart in some way, please press the subscribe button for our channel, like and share this video, so that every day you can hear more meaningful and captivating stories. We would truly love to know how you feel about Cora's story. What part of her journey moved you the most? So please don't hesitate to leave a comment, sharing the feelings from deep within your heart. Because every comment from you is something we deeply value and listen to. Thank you for taking the time to stay with us until the very last seconds. We wish you and the people you love abundant health, a joyful life, peace of mind, and calm in every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.